Check. Good to go? All right. Hi, my name's Kevin, and this is Responder for Purple Teams. So this is the outline of the talk. I'll tell you who I am, why I wanted to do this talk, an overview of Responder. Who in the room is familiar with Responder? Who knows of this tool? Okay, a few of you. Probably more from an offensive side than a defensive side. The point of this talk is to kind of cover it from both perspectives. We'll talk about related tools to Responder, the WPAD attack that's getting a lot of noise recently for whatever reason, analyze mode in Responder, which is very, very powerful, and some defense that you can use against Responder. So who am I? I am a full spectrum cyber person. I've been doing this for about 20 years across the spectrum of industries and red team, blue team. I'm an advanced persistent Pittsburgher. Please don't throw anything. And thank you, Cleveland, for having me back for a third time. I love this conference. It's one of the best B-sides around. So why this talk? Why do this thing? Well, all teams can learn valuable information from Responder. You can learn about the attacks and threats that you can accomplish with it. You can find misconfigurations within your network with it. And you can actually detect Responder because it's pretty noisy out of the box. But here's why I really wanted to do this talk. My own security tool betrayed me. And I found this out thanks to Responder. So it was definitely a shame on that vendor, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So an overview of Responder. It is an LLMNR, NBTNS, MDNS poisoner. All three of those protocols right there are broadcast name resolution protocols, which is to say a PC looking for a desired name is just going to broadcast out to the network, hey, who are you? Can anybody help me with this name to resolve it? It is also an SMB, Microsoft SQL, HTTP, LDAP, FTP, POP3, IMAP, SMTP auth server, meaning it can accept authentication for any of those types of services. And you use the poisoner and the authentication servers in combination to be able to gather credentials. It has a WPAD proxy server built in, which is very handy for grabbing browsers. For those that don't know, WPAD is a web proxy auto detect. So if you go into Internet Explorer, there's a little checkbox that says, detect my proxy settings for me. That's WPAD. And so it has a built-in server that can do some evil things. It has a DHCP informed spoofer, which allows you to actually get in the middle of a DHCP request from an endpoint and insert your own default gateway and your own DNS server while actually serving up the IP from the original DHCP server. Pretty slick. It does some very detailed OS fingerprinting for anything that happens to come across that Responder grabs. It can tell you if the network you're on supports ICMP relaying, which allows for other type of middling attacks. And it has a really great analyze mode, which we'll talk about a little more, and it's under active development. You can pull this any day of the week, and it'll have bug fixes and changes. So just a quick review of the poisoner. LLMNR, it stands for Link Local Multicast Name Resolution. Again, it allows name resolution of neighboring systems without a DNS server. It's all happening via broadcast, right? Supported Windows Vista through Windows 10. There's also Linux support. Then we have NetBIOS name service, which is old school Windows. This is Windows NT type stuff, right? Wins. That's kind of where this comes from. It's old school Windows, but it's still enabled by default, of course. Thank you, Microsoft. And then there's MDNS, which is multicast DNS. Think Apple's Bonjour, their rendezvous protocol. But tons of stuff supports this protocol now. Printers, cameras, my TiVo at home for some reason. I don't know why, but it does. And then to take a look at the auth servers, so for example, the SMB auth server responds. That's why the tool I think is called Responder. SMB auth server responds and collects clear text credentials and NTLM v1, v2 hashes. Very powerful. You can use the SMB auth server to hand off to things like SMB relay to do pass the hash attacks and that kind of stuff. The MS SQL responder looks just like SQL Server 2005. It also collects NTLM v1, v2 hashes. The HTTP server kind of looks like IIS. It tries to look like IIS. It really doesn't, but it collects clear text credentials, which is handy, NTLM v1, v2 hashes, and can also serve up a WPAD.dat, which we'll get into how that works. And then the mail protocols, LDAP, FTP, this is just all about gathering clear text credentials. Responder says, hey, I'm the FTP server you're looking for. User authenticates, and then all of a sudden, you just gave up your creds. So let's take a look at the SMB attack real quick. Of course, in any good attack scenario, you have to have a bad guy wearing a ski mask and a tie and typing with one hand. But the way it works is the victims go to their DNS server and they say, hey, who is whack whack serve R? Right? So somebody mistyped. They meant to go to server and they mistyped and typed serve R. Well, the DNS server is going to say, I have no idea who you're looking for, buddy. I don't have an entry for that. So the victims are going to say, hey, everyone, via broadcast, who is serve R? And if there's an attacker on the wire running responder, he's going to come back and say, hey, that's me. How you doing? Here's my challenge. And then the target system will come back and say, hey, awesome. Here's my NTLM v1, v2 response. Let's go to town. So obviously, you know, in this case, the victims just gave up potentially weak hashes to an attacker by doing nothing but mistyping the file server that they were trying to get to. Some related tools to Responder. There's Responder for Windows. It's in beta, but it is a pretty functional version of Responder for Windows. There's also a PowerShell implementation called Inve that does exactly all the same stuff as Responder. It's just in pure PowerShell, which is kind of slick. There's a tool called Gladius, which you can run alongside Responder, and all it does is monitor the Responder database for new hashes, and when a new hash rolls into that database, it just goes off and sends them to John and starts cracking. And then there's Chuckle, which is a really slick tool for pen testers anyway. It's essentially doing automatic SMB ownage, right? It finds targets with Nmap automatically, generates a payload that's not going to get picked up by antivirus using veil evasion, intercepts the SMB connections, and delivers the payload using a combination of responder and SMB relay. And then eventually you're getting a shell, interpreter shell in Metasploit. Okay, we'll talk about the responder WPAD proxy real quick. It responds to broadcast requests for WPAD servers, which are common if you have that checkbox in Internet Explorer ticked. It listens on a standard ISA port, TCP 3141, and it's able to grab cookies and authentication data. It's able to inject HTML in non-encrypted sessions, and actually in encrypted sessions as well, if the user accepts the certificate from responder and says, yes, I'm cool with that error message. And then it also allows EXE interception and replacement. So it'll sit there and watch for any user that goes out and attempts to download an EXE, and it'll replace that EXE with its own, which of course is a malicious payload that gives you some sort of backdoor. The attack itself is well known by pen testers, but it's apparently new to US CERT. US CERT issued a bulletin about this at the end of May, essentially saying that WPAD is an attack. But this is pretty well known. I mean, the pen test community is kind of like, I guess that's it, but we've kind of known about this, right? Haven't we known about it? There was a Black Hat talk in 2007. Dave Kennedy did an article from TrustedSec in 2013. Like, this is not new, but US CERT, it's like mind-blowing for these guys, right? And then there's actually a Black Hat talk coming this year on this bad tunnel vulnerability, which was MS16-077, just from June. This patch was just released, and what it prevents is essentially WPAD requests from exiting out of the internal network and going out to the internet, which is what the bad tunnel attack is all about. So just for illustration, you know, here we go with our victims and our attacker. We'll throw the internet in there as well. And so the victims say, hey, who is WPAD? DNS server says, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't have an entry for that. So the victims go ahead and broadcast out, who is WPAD? And if there's an attacker on the wire, the attacker can say, hey, that's me. Here's my WPAD.dat, which configures the browser to point to them as a proxy. And now the victims are sending all of the traffic from the browser to the attacker, and the attacker has man in the middle. That's how that attack works. So let's talk about analyze mode for a second, and kind of look at it from more of a defensive point of view. Analyze mode lets you see what could be owned. It can also let you see systems that are eager to authenticate, because you may have these on your network. Things like inventory or CMDB systems, patch management systems, software deployments, and network access control systems, which brings me back to the tool that betrayed me. I'm going to tell a little bit of a NAC NAC joke, okay? And it's horrible pun, I apologize, but here's how it goes. Responder says, NAC NAC, hi, I'm on your network. And NAC says, hey, who's there? And responder says, some really weird box. I don't look like anything you've ever seen. And then NAC says, some really weird box who? Never mind. Here's the username and NTLM v1 hash for a domain admin. So to replay that in technical terms, I connected a Kali box with responder in analyze mode, and 30 seconds later, I got back a DA username and NTLM v1 response. Okay? So I think at this point we've reached peak fail, right? A system meant to detect and mitigate rogue devices is actually sending DA credentials, and you might as well call them credentials because NTLM v1 is very crackable, right? Sending DA credentials to rogue devices. It's doing absolutely the opposite of what it should be doing, right? The system was built per the vendor's documentation with professional support. There's no mention of NTLM v1 anywhere in their documentations. This is the default config out of the box, and they don't tell you to change it. And responder on Linux looks nothing like a Windows domain member, so why would you ever try to authenticate to it in the first place? Kind of scary. Why would you ever do that? So it was kind of like a happiness denied moment. It's like, hey guys, we have this really awesome solution. It's going to take care of all our problems, find all the rogue endpoints. This is going to be really great. Oh, no. Wasted. Wasted. Not at all. So I guess the point is use analyze mode. Your security, inventory, asset management tools can and may be betraying you right now. Your endpoints might be misconfigured. Your network might be configured to allow ICMP relaying, right? In the end, responder, it ain't just for pen tests. You can use this as a defender as well. So this morning, I just had to fire it up on the BSides CLE Wi-Fi just to see what was happening out there. And take a look. We got all kinds of NetBIOS name service requests floating around out there. These are endpoints that are on the Wi-Fi right now. We got one of them that wants to do WPAD. Oh boy. So go check that box. As far as detecting responder, if you have some sort of NAC or something like that, even if you just run regular Nmaps on your network, you can actually find this thing pretty easy if it's sitting out there running. It can be, the fingerprint can be changed in package.py. That's part of the responder configuration files. It also has a telltale WPAD.dat, but that's also customizable. In the end, nothing on your network should be serving up a WPAD.dat ever, except for valid WPAD.dat servers. So maybe if you see a web server suddenly pop up on your network and it's serving WPAD.dat, maybe you got to go panic and grab that thing and yank it off the network. Because it's definitely doing something bad. And any endpoint listening on some of these ports just looks like nonsense. You know, you shouldn't have something that just comes online, it's listening on pop 3, you know, or these kind of things. So if you look at this is, again, the default responder config. If you run an Nmap against it, and these are all the ports, TCP and UDP, that responder listens on, this is what you'll get back with this command. So you'll see, you know, web server, and it looks like TCP wrapd, but it actually has some NTLM info, and it has like all these really weird, and it's identifying itself as Windows Server 2003. So that looks shifty, you know. The SMTP and POP3 banners are kind of odd. If we come over and look at the ISA proxy that it spins up to do its WPAD trick, it's identifying itself as Python. So that's not right. So some pretty telltale stuff right there. As far as the WPAD.dat, you can just go wget it from a host running responder, or just look at the responder.config and it'll call itself out in a few places that this is a responder proxy server. So, defense against this thing, what do? It sounds like horribleness. It actually isn't that bad. Disable some of these zero config protocols, broadcast protocols, right? They're very handy in your house, but they're very dangerous in the enterprise. There's no need to run NetBIOS name service anymore. There just isn't. Disable WPAD altogether and set explicit proxies if you need to use a proxy. You always get a little bit of pushback from the client team. They say, well, what if, corporate person, so maybe an executive walks into a network and they actually use WPAD in their environment? Well, then there's a couple clicks that must be clicked. But shutting it off is going to reduce risk a lot more than it's going to increase inconvenience. Add a WPAD entry in DNS. And this is kind of interesting the way that Microsoft has implemented it in their DNS implementation, but that will prevent broadcasts from occurring. Users will actually get back a response for WPAD, and maybe that's 127.0.0.1 or some nonsense, right? And then scan for responder instances. No one should ever be serving up WPAD.dat. SMB signing is a way to defeat some of the attacks I talked about with Chuckle. It can be painful with legacy systems, but it's not like everything has to do SMB signing or everything does not have to do SMB signing. So at least enable it on your file servers that are housing critical data so that you can make sure that connections can't get spoofed between the client and the server. And monitor and segment your networks. Everybody knows. So to disable LLMNR, man, I practiced that 100 times too, still can't get it. You can do it in group policy. This is where you have to go to do it. There's definitely a way to do it in group policy. You can do it in the registry as well. And I'm going to post, these slides will be up for people to grab, so don't worry about taking pictures or scrambling to write this stuff down. Here's a screenshot of what that config looks like right there. Turn it off, enabled. A little bit backwards, but makes sense. Disable NetBIOS name service. This is ancient stuff. I guarantee you don't need it. On a single machine, this is how you do it. Via DHCP, you can also do it from DHCP by setting a DHCP option. And that'll just enforce that any machine getting an IP address from your DHCP server will have NetBIOS name service disabled. Disable WPAD, so don't ever try to auto-discover your proxies. On a single machine, this is where you go to do it. You can disable this service, which will accomplish the same thing. Via GPO, you can do it in there. And then via DHCP option 252. That's another way to do it. And then from the server side, create an internal and external DNS entry for wpad.domain.com. But before you do that, make sure you allow your Windows DNS servers to permit you to serve up a WPAD.dat. Now, it doesn't make sense, but if you follow this article, what you'll find is that Microsoft in 2008 and up, they actually do not allow their DNS servers to serve a WPAD.dat. And the reasoning for that was they said that, well, if an attacker compromised your DNS servers and was able to set WPAD.dat, then they could compromise additional endpoints. And it's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Except that most of the time, DNS is running on a domain controller, and if your domain controller is compromised in that way, probably got bigger problems. So this article will tell you how to go in there and allow Microsoft DNS servers to serve a WPAD.dat, or serve an entry, I'm sorry, for WPAD.domain.com. And that's a way to affect it from the server side. Questions? Sir. That's right. Yeah, it's a local, on a per subnet basis, that's your attack, service. I'm sorry? What? The NAC that I was using was not Cisco's. But we can talk vendors once the camera's turned off. But it wasn't, again, this was just the NAC, in this case, seeing a host coming online and doing a really poor job of identifying that host. It was, sees the endpoint come online, and it was exactly 30 seconds. I tested it a few times. It was just one of its methods of trying to identify what are you. Unfortunately, it was a really bad way of doing that. Any other questions? Sir?
So what about teams that are purple teams that are more on the blue side? What do you recommend for being able to use responders for that? It seems like typically responders heavily use more red teams than blue side. So how can you utilize it for more of the blue side?
I would say analyze mode to detect misconfigurations, absolutely. And then if you truly have a purple team where the red team is informing the blue team, then maybe have the red team as a part of an engagement stands up a responder instance, and you guys got to try to find it. And maybe they stand it up in a default type config so that you can use some of those nmaps to try to actually find that instance. Look for WPAD.dats. Sure. No, you can actually find it across subnets because those TCP ports are open, the UDP ports are open. So yeah, you can cross subnets for detection. Now, if you're just looking for the broadcasts, then you're only going to see the actual poisoning activity if you're on that subnet. Anybody else? So again, I'm going to post these slides, but these are all some really great resources. And NCC Group actually published a really great paper on Wednesday. Couldn't wait a week, could you guys? Just had to do it right before my talk. But it's really a fantastic breakdown of how the whole broadcast resolution thing works, and a lot on how to defeat some of these attacks as well. All right, thanks a lot, guys.